Margaret Chen stood at the entrance of the prestigious Riverside Music Academy, her worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder. The building loomed before her with its marble columns and polished brass doors that reflected the afternoon sun. She had walked past this place countless times over the past 15 years, always admiring it from a distance, never imagining she would one day step inside. At 53 years old, Margaret worked as a cleaner at 3 different office buildings downtown. Her hands were rough from years of scrubbing floors and wiping windows. She wore simple clothes from thrift stores, and her graying hair was always pulled back in a practical bun. Most people who passed her on the street barely noticed her. She had become invisible in the way that working-class people often do in wealthy neighborhoods. But today was different. Today, Margaret had mustered the courage to walk through those brass doors. Her daughter Emma was getting married in 3 months, and Margaret had a dream. She wanted to play the piano at her daughter's wedding. Not just any song, but the piece that Emma's late father used to hum when he rocked their baby girl to sleep 28 years ago. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Margaret's husband David had died in a construction accident when Emma was only 6 years old. The compensation money had barely covered the funeral costs and a few months of rent. Margaret had been forced to take on multiple cleaning jobs to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. There had been no money for luxuries, no money for piano lessons, no money for anything beyond basic survival. What nobody knew, what Margaret had kept hidden for decades, was that she had once been a different person entirely. Before Emma was born, before she married David, before life took its unexpected turns, Margaret had been a piano student at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music. She had been considered a prodigy, winning competitions across China as a teenager. Her teachers had predicted a brilliant career as a concert pianist, but life had other plans. Her parents had fallen ill, and medical bills consumed everything. Margaret had dropped out of the conservatory in her second year to work and support her family. She eventually immigrated to America, hoping for better opportunities, where she met David at a community center. They fell in love quickly, married within a year, and Emma arrived soon after. David knew she had studied music, but she had downplayed her abilities, and he never heard her play. After he died, there simply was no time or money for pianos or music. The instruments she cleaned around in office lobbies and hotel lounges were reminders of a life she had left behind. Margaret pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the cool, air-conditioned lobby. The walls were decorated with photographs of famous musicians who had studied there. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, and the faint sound of someone practicing scales drifted from somewhere deep within the building. The receptionist, a young woman in her 20s with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expensive-looking dress, looked up from her computer screen. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but with an edge that suggested she was already evaluating whether Margaret belonged there. "Yes, I would like to inquire about renting a practice room," Margaret said softly, her accent still carrying traces of her Chinese heritage despite decades in America. The receptionist's eyebrows rose slightly. "A practice room? Are you a student here?" "No, I'm not a student. I just need to practice the piano for a few hours." "I can pay," Margaret said, reaching for her purse. The receptionist exchanged a glance with another staff member who had emerged from a side office. The young man, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather folder, looked Margaret up and down with barely concealed amusement. "Our practice rooms are reserved for academy students and professional musicians," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We don't rent them out to the general public." Margaret felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I understand, but perhaps I could make a special arrangement?" "It would only be for a few weeks. I am preparing for my daughter's wedding," the young man smirked. "Ma'am, our Steinway pianos are very expensive instruments. They require experienced players. Perhaps you could try the community center on 5th Street. I believe they have keyboards available." Another staff member, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and designer glasses, had joined them. She looked at Margaret with thinly veiled disdain. "What piece are you preparing?" she asked, her tone making it clear she expected Margaret to name something simple. "Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, No. 2, Margaret answered quietly. All 3 staff members exchanged glances, and the receptionist actually let out a small laugh. "That's quite an ambitious choice," she said, not bothering to hide her skepticism. "That piece requires years of advanced training. It's not something a beginner can just learn in a few weeks. Margaret felt tears pricking at her eyes, but she held them back. She had faced worse humiliation in her life. I understand. Thank you for your time, she said, turning to leave. As she reached the door, a voice called out from across the lobby. Oh, wait just a moment, please. Margaret turned to see an elderly man walking toward her with the aid of a carved wooden cane. He was impeccably dressed in a three-piece suit, and his white hair was combed back neatly. His eyes, though aged, sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. This was Professor Heinrich Müller, the Academy's founder and one of the most respected piano teachers in the country. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, he said in a warm voice carrying a slight German accent. You wish to play Chopin for your daughter's wedding? Yes, sir, Margaret replied, surprised that someone was actually taking her seriously. A beautiful choice, he nodded approvingly. Tell me, have you played before? Margaret hesitated. The truth was complicated, and she was used to keeping it simple. A long time ago, yes. Many years. Professor Müller studied her face carefully, and something in his expression changed. It was as if he recognized something in her eyes that others had missed. How long since you last played? 31 years, Margaret admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The staff members behind her scoffed audibly, but Professor Müller raised his hand to silence them. And before that? Where did you study? Shanghai Conservatory, Margaret said simply, not wanting to elaborate. The professor's eyes widened. Indeed, that's a fine institution. What made you stop playing? Margaret's throat tightened. Life happened, sir. Family responsibilities. My husband died, and I had to work to support my daughter. Professor Müller nodded slowly, understanding crossing his weathered face. He had seen many talented musicians whose careers had been derailed by circumstances beyond their control. And now you wish to return to the piano for your daughter. Just for one song, sir. For her wedding day. Her father used to hum this melody to her when she was a baby. I want to give her this gift, to feel like he's there with us in some way. The professor was quiet for a long moment, leaning on his cane. Then he turned to his staff with a sharp look that made them straighten up immediately. I would like to hear this lady play, he announced. Please prepare practice room 3. The receptionist started to protest. Professor, I don't think... That was not a request, he said firmly, his voice taking on an authoritative tone that left no room for argument. Room 3, please, now. The practice room was more elegant than any space Margaret had been in for years. The walls were soundproofed with rich acoustic panels, and afternoon light streamed through tall windows. In the center of the room sat a magnificent Steinway grand piano, its black surface so perfectly polished that Margaret could see her reflection in it. The sight of it took her breath away. Professor Müller gestured toward the piano bench. Please sit. Margaret approached the instrument with hesitant steps. Her hands trembled as she set down her canvas bag. The staff members had followed them into the room, standing near the door with crossed arms and barely suppressed smirks on their faces. They were clearly expecting to witness an embarrassing performance, something they would probably gossip about later in the break room. She sat on the leather bench and stared at the keys. 88 black and white keys that had once been as familiar to her as her own hands. 3 decades of silence stretched between her and this instrument. Her fingers felt stiff, clumsy. What if she had forgotten everything? What if the music that once flowed through her like breathing had dried up completely? Take your time, Professor Müller said gently, pulling up a chair to sit nearby. There is no rush. Margaret placed her fingers on the keys. They felt cool and smooth beneath her rough, work-worn hands. She closed her eyes and tried to remember, not just the notes, not just the technical aspects, but the feeling, the emotion that Chopin had poured into this piece. The nocturne was about longing, about beauty found in darkness, about tender moments that slip away too quickly. She thought about David, the way he used to smile when he came home from work, dusty from the construction site but still full of energy to play with baby Emma, how he would hum this melody without even knowing what it was called or who composed it. He had heard it somewhere, maybe on a radio or in a store, and it had stuck with him. Now he was gone, and Emma was about to start her own family. Margaret's fingers pressed down and the first notes emerged, soft, hesitant, but recognizable, the opening of Chopin's Nocturne. Her left hand found the rolling accompaniment pattern, while her right hand searched for the melody. The first phrase was shaky, the rhythm uncertain. She could hear the mistakes, the awkward pauses where her fingers didn't quite remember where to go next. Behind her, the receptionist whispered something to the young man in the suit, and they both chuckled quietly. Margaret's cheeks burned with shame, but she kept going. She had survived worse than mockery. She had survived poverty, loss, and 30 years of backbreaking labor. She could survive this. As she continued playing, something began to shift. Her fingers started remembering patterns her conscious mind had forgotten. Muscle memory, buried deep after 3 decades, began to resurface. The notes came more smoothly. Her hands moved with increasing confidence across the keys. The melody started to breathe, to sing the way Chopin had intended. Professor Muller leaned forward in his chair, his expression changing from polite interest to focused attention. He recognized what he was hearing. This was not the playing of an amateur who had taken a few lessons. This was someone who had been trained properly, someone who understood the architecture of the music, even if the execution was rusty. Margaret reached the middle section of the piece, where the melody becomes more passionate, more urgent. Her right hand climbed higher on the keyboard, and despite her nervousness, despite the years away from the piano, she felt something awakening inside her. It was like a door in her heart that had been locked for 30 years was beginning to open. The music was still there. It had always been there, waiting. She made mistakes. Several wrong notes, a few stumbled passages, moments where her fingers tangled and she had to stop and restart a measure. But underneath the technical imperfection, there was something else. Something that made Professor Muller's eyes grow misty. There was genuine musicality in her playing. There was understanding. There was soul. The staff members at the door had stopped whispering. They were listening now, their expressions confused. This was not what they had expected to hear. This was not some deluded housewife attempting a piece beyond her abilities. This was someone who actually knew what they were doing, even if they were out of practice. Margaret played through to the end, the final notes fading into the quiet room like the last stars disappearing at dawn. She lifted her hands from the keys and sat very still, her heart pounding. She had forgotten how it felt to play, the way music moved through your body, the way it connected you to something larger than yourself. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Professor Muller began to clap. Not the polite applause you give to be kind, but genuine, enthusiastic applause. He stood up from his chair, his eyes bright with emotion. "Remarkable," he said. "Truly remarkable. You have been away from the piano for 30 years, and yet the foundation remains strong. Your technique is rusty, yes, but your musicality is intact. Actually, more than intact. You understand this piece deeply." Margaret turned to look at him, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't realized she was crying. "I made so many mistakes," she said, her voice breaking. "Mistakes can be fixed with practice," the professor replied, waving his hand dismissively. "What you have, what you demonstrated just now, cannot be taught. It is either in you or it is not, and it is most definitely in you." He turned to his stunned staff members. "Did I not tell you? Did I not say there was something about her?" The receptionist looked down at her shoes, clearly embarrassed. The young man in the suit had lost his smirk entirely. The middle-aged woman with designer glasses cleared her throat uncomfortably. Professor Muller turned back to Margaret. "You studied at Shanghai Conservatory, you said? Tell me honestly, what level did you reach before you stopped?" Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I was in my 2nd year. I had won some regional competitions as a teenager. My teachers thought I might have a career. But my parents became ill and I had to leave school to help support the family. Then I moved to America, got married, had my daughter. Life went in a different direction." The professor nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And you have not touched a piano in all this time?" "Only to clean around them, sir. I work as a cleaner in office buildings. Sometimes I dust the pianos in lobbies and conference rooms, but I never play them. It seemed like a life that belonged to someone else, someone I used to be." Professor Muller walked over to the window, gazing out at the street below. He was quiet for a moment, then turned back to Margaret with decision in his eyes. "I have a proposal for you," he said. "I would like to teach you myself. Private lessons right here at the Academy. We will work on the Chopin Nocturne and rebuild your technique. You will be ready to play at your daughter's wedding, I promise you this." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "Professor, I cannot afford lessons here. I barely make enough to pay my rent and save a little for Emma's wedding. Your academy is for wealthy students. I am offering to teach you for free," he said firmly. "Consider it a scholarship." No. Consider it my personal interest in helping a talented musician return to her art. I have been teaching for 50 years, and I have seen many students with good technique and no soul. You have both even after 3 decades away. This is rare. This is worth nurturing. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. The generosity of the offer overwhelmed her. Why would you do this for me? She finally managed to ask. Professor Muller smiled, a sad but warm smile. Because I almost made the same mistake you did many years ago. I almost gave up music for other responsibilities. Someone gave me a second chance and it changed my life. Now I can give you that same gift. Besides, he added with a twinkle in his eye, I am quite curious to see how well you can play this nocturne with proper preparation. Call it an old teacher's selfish interest. The staff members at the door looked stunned. They had never seen Professor Muller offer free private lessons to anyone. He was notoriously selective about his students and charged premium rates for his time. Margaret began her lessons the following week. She would arrive at the academy every Tuesday and Thursday evening after finishing her cleaning jobs, usually around 7 in the evening. She was always tired, her back aching from hours of scrubbing and lifting. But the moment she sat at the piano, the exhaustion seemed to fade away. Professor Muller was a demanding teacher but also incredibly patient. He worked with her systematically, starting with scales and arpeggios to rebuild the flexibility and strength in her fingers. Her hands had grown stiff from years of manual labor, the joints sometimes painful, but slowly they began to remember their old capabilities. Your muscle memory is extraordinary, the professor told her during their 3rd lesson. The body remembers what the mind forgets. We are not starting from zero. We are excavating something that was buried but never truly lost. The nocturne required delicate control and subtle shading. Chopin's music demanded that each note sing with its own color and emotion. It was not enough to simply play the correct notes at the correct time. The piece had to breathe, to speak, to tell its story. Professor Muller worked with her on dynamics, on the gentle rise and fall of phrases, on the way the left hand should support the melody without overwhelming it. Margaret practiced whenever she could find time. She would wake up early before her morning cleaning shift and practice on an old digital keyboard she had bought from a pawn shop, with money saved from skipping lunches. The sound was nothing like the Steinway at the academy, but it allowed her to work on the finger patterns and memorization. Her neighbors probably wondered about the piano sounds coming from her apartment at 5 in the morning, but nobody complained. Emma noticed the change in her mother. Mom, you seem different lately, she said one evening when Margaret came home from a lesson. You look happier. Tired but happy. Margaret smiled and hugged her daughter. I am preparing a surprise for your wedding, she said. That is all I can tell you for now. A surprise? Mom, you are not spending too much money, are you? You know Jack and I want a simple wedding. We do not need anything fancy. This is not about money, sweetheart. This is about love. Trust me. At the academy, word had spread about the cleaning lady who was taking private lessons with Professor Muller. Some of the younger students were curious, others dismissive. The receptionist who had laughed at Margaret on that first day had been disciplined by the professor and was now coolly professional, though clearly still skeptical. But not everyone at the academy was unkind. One young student, a talented 19-year-old named Sofia Rodriguez, approached Margaret one evening as she was leaving a lesson. Sofia was a scholarship student herself from a working-class immigrant family, and she recognized something of her own struggle in Margaret's story. Mrs. Chen, I heard you are learning the Chopin Nocturne in E-flat. That is one of my favorite pieces, Sofia said shyly. If you ever want someone to play it for you so you can hear how it should sound, I would be happy to help. Margaret was touched by the gesture. Thank you, dear. That is very kind. Actually, yes, I would love to hear you play it. Sometimes I get so lost in the technical details that I forget the overall feeling of the piece. Sofia played the nocturne for Margaret in one of the practice rooms, and it was like hearing it for the first time. The young woman's interpretation was fresh and lovely, full of youthful emotion. Margaret listened with tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the pure beauty of it. That was wonderful, Margaret said when Sofia finished. You have a gift, Sofia blushed. Thank you. But you know, when I heard you playing it last week through the practice room door, I heard something different, something deeper. Like you understand the sadness underneath the beauty. That is harder to fake than good technique. The two women became friends. Sophia would sometimes join Margaret for tea after lessons, and they would talk about music, about life, about the challenges of being taken seriously in a world that often judged people by their appearance or background. Sophia reminded Margaret of herself at that age, full of dreams and determination. As the weeks passed, Margaret's playing improved dramatically. The stiffness left her fingers. The notes came more naturally. She could play through the entire nocturne without major mistakes. Though she was still working on making it truly sing, Professor Muller pushed her to dig deeper into the emotion of the piece. "You are playing the notes correctly, but you are being too careful," he told her during one lesson. "You are afraid to make mistakes, so you hold back." Chopin did not write this music to be played carefully. He wrote it to be felt. You must be willing to risk failure to achieve beauty. Margaret understood what he meant. She had spent 30 years being careful, playing it safe, not taking risks because she could not afford to fail. But music demanded something different. It demanded vulnerability, honesty, the willingness to open your heart completely. "Play it again," the professor said. "But this time, do not think about your daughter's wedding. Do not think about the audience. Think about a moment of perfect beauty that you once experienced and lost. Pour that into the music." Margaret closed her eyes and let her mind drift back. She remembered a night, years ago, when David had taken her to a small park near their apartment. Emma had been about 3 years old, asleep in her stroller. They had no money for entertainment, so they just walked and talked, enjoying the cool evening air. David had suddenly pulled her into a dance right there on the path, humming that familiar melody, spinning her around under the streetlights. She had laughed, feeling completely happy despite their struggles, despite their poverty, despite everything. It had been a perfect moment, one she had forgotten in the grind of survival that followed his death. She poured that memory into the piano. Her hands moved over the keys with new freedom. The melody soared and dipped, telling a story of love and loss, of beauty found in ordinary moments, of tenderness that transcends time. When she finished, she opened her eyes to find Professor Muller wiping tears from his cheeks. "There," he said quietly, "that is the music. That is what we have been searching for. Do not lose that feeling." Margaret's hands were shaking, but she felt exhilarated. She had connected with something she thought she had lost forever. The part of herself that was not just a worker, not just a mother, not just a survivor, but an artist. The wedding was now 6 weeks away. Professor Muller increased their lessons to 3 times a week. He wanted Margaret to be so comfortable with the piece that she could play it even with the inevitable nervousness of performing at her daughter's wedding. They worked on managing anxiety, on staying centered when her heart was racing, on trusting her preparation. One evening, as Margaret was leaving the academy, she encountered the young man in the expensive suit who had been so dismissive on her first visit. He stopped in the hallway looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Chen," he said, clearing his throat, "I wanted to apologize for my behavior when you first came here. I was rude and dismissive. I made assumptions based on your appearance. That was wrong of me." Margaret studied his face. He seemed genuinely remorseful. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them." "Professor Muller gave me quite a lecture about judging people," he admitted. "He told me I was a fool who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. He said I would never be a good musician if I could not recognize genuine talent when I saw it, regardless of how it was packaged." Margaret smiled. "The professor is a wise man. He also mentioned that you might be interested in applying for a teaching position here after the wedding," the young man added. "The academy needs more instructors for adult beginners, people who can relate to students who are coming to music later in life or returning after years away. He thinks you would be perfect for it." Margaret stood in the hallway, stunned by what she had just heard. A teaching position at the Riverside Music Academy? It seemed impossible, like something from a dream. She had spent so many years invisible, just another cleaning lady that people passed without noticing. Now she was being offered a chance to do something she loved, something meaningful. "I do not have a degree," Margaret said slowly. "I only completed 2 years at the conservatory before I had to leave." "Would that not be a problem?" The young man shook his head. "Professor Muller says your experience and your story are worth more than any certificate. He believes you could inspire students in ways that someone with perfect credentials, but no life experience never could. Think about it, at least. He plans to discuss it with you formally after the wedding. Margaret walked home that evening with her mind spinning. Could this be real? Could she actually return to music not just as a hobby but as a profession? The pay would not be enormous, but it would be dignified work, something that used her mind and her skills rather than just her physical labor. She could cut back on her cleaning jobs, maybe even give them up entirely. Her back and knees would certainly thank her, but doubt crept in too. Who was she to teach music? She had been away from it for so long. What if she was not good enough? What if this was all some kind of mistake, and they would eventually realize she was just a cleaning lady pretending to be something more? At her next lesson, Professor Miller brought up the subject himself. I have been thinking about your future, he said without preamble. You have a gift, Margaret, not just for playing but for understanding music deeply. That kind of understanding can be taught to others if you are willing to learn how to teach. I am overwhelmed by the offer, Margaret admitted, but I am also frightened. What if I am not good enough? What if I disappoint you? The professor smiled. Do you know what makes a great teacher? It is not being perfect. It is being honest about the struggle. You understand what it means to lose music and find it again. You understand what it costs to pursue beauty in a world that demands practical survival. Your students will see themselves in you, especially those who come to music with doubt and fear. You will know how to reach them because you have walked their path. He pulled out a folder from his desk drawer. I have been making inquiries. There is a program that allows experienced musicians to earn teaching certification through a combination of coursework and supervised teaching practice. It would take about a year, but you could work at the academy part-time while completing it. The board has already approved my recommendation to hire you. Margaret felt tears welling up again. She seemed to cry so much these days, but they were different tears than the ones she had shed over the years. These were tears of hope, of possibility, of life opening up in ways she had stopped imagining were possible. When Emma was little, Margaret said quietly, after David died, I used to lie awake at night feeling like I had become someone I did not recognize. The girl who played Chopin and dreamed of concert halls felt like a character in a story I had read once but could not quite remember. I was just a tired woman scrubbing toilets, watching the years go by, waiting for nothing in particular. Now I feel like I am waking up from a long sleep. Then wake up completely, the professor said firmly. Say yes to this. Give yourself permission to be more than just a survivor. Become someone who lives fully, who creates beauty, who helps others find their voices. Your daughter is about to start her new life. Let this be the beginning of yours. Margaret wiped her eyes and nodded. Yes, I will do it. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for seeing something in me that I had stopped seeing in myself. They spent the rest of the lesson working on the nocturne, but Margaret played with a new energy. The piece was no longer just about her daughter's wedding. It was about rebirth, about second chances, about the persistence of beauty even through decades of darkness. Every note felt like a declaration that she was still here, still capable of feeling deeply and expressing that feeling through music. As the wedding approached, Emma grew more excited and curious about her mother's mysterious surprise. Mom, you have to give me a hint, she pleaded. Is it a dress? A cake? What is it? You will see on the day, Margaret said with a smile. I promise it will be special. Emma's fiancé, Jack, had planned a small intimate wedding ceremony in a historic mansion that had been converted into an event space. The venue had a beautiful music room with a grand piano, which Emma had thought was just a decorative element. She had no idea that her mother had specifically requested that venue because of that instrument. Professor Miller came to the academy one final time before the wedding for a dress rehearsal. He had invited a small audience of academy staff and students to simulate the pressure of performing for others. Margaret was nervous, her hands cold and slightly shaky as she sat at the piano. Sophia was there in the audience, along with several other students who had befriended Margaret over the past months. Even the receptionist had come, looking genuinely interested to hear how Margaret had progressed. The young man in the suit was there too, as was the middle-aged woman with designer glasses who had been so dismissive at first. Remember, Professor Muller said quietly before she began, you are not playing for them. You are playing for your daughter, for your late husband, for yourself. Let everything else fade away. Margaret closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and placed her fingers on the keys. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne emerged, soft and tender. The melody unfurled like a flower opening to the sun. Her left hand provided the gentle rolling accompaniment steady as a heartbeat, while her right hand sang the bittersweet melody. She had practiced this piece hundreds of times over the past 3 months, but this felt different. This felt real. She thought about David, about Emma as a baby, about all the years of struggle and survival, about dreams deferred but not destroyed. All of it flowed through her fingers into the music. There were no mistakes this time. The technical challenges that had seemed so daunting months ago now felt natural. Her hands moved confidently across the keyboard. The dynamics swelled and receded with perfect control. The tempo breathed naturally, never rushing, never dragging, just flowing like a conversation with an old friend. When she reached the middle section, where the melody becomes more impassioned, she played with her whole heart. This was the climax of the piece, where Chopin allows the emotion to overflow, where the restrained beauty of the opening gives way to something more urgent and profound. Margaret leaned into it, her hands stretching across the keyboard, drawing out every ounce of feeling from each note. Then the melody returned, quieter now, reflective. The nocturne was ending the way it began, but transformed by everything that had happened in between. The final notes faded into silence, and Margaret held her hands suspended above the keys for a moment before lowering them to her lap. The practice room erupted in applause. People were standing, some wiping their eyes. Sophia was crying openly, and even the skeptical receptionist looked moved. Professor Miller stood with his hands clasped together, his face radiant with pride. "Perfect," he said simply. "That was perfect. Your daughter will be so lucky to hear this on her wedding day." Margaret stood up from the piano, overwhelmed by the response. These people had heard her journey from that first shaky attempt 3 months ago to this moment. They had witnessed her transformation, and their applause felt like validation not just of her playing but of her decision to reclaim this part of herself. The morning of Emma's wedding arrived with perfect spring weather. The sky was clear and blue, with just a hint of coolness in the air that would warm as the day progressed. Margaret woke early, too excited and nervous to sleep. She had pressed her simple but elegant dress the night before, a navy blue one that Emma had helped her pick out. It was the nicest dress she had owned in years. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, seeing not just the 53-year-old cleaning lady with rough hands and graying hair, but also the young woman who had once played for audiences in Shanghai, the devoted wife who had loved David completely, the determined mother who had sacrificed everything for her daughter, and now, the musician who was stepping back into the light. At the venue, Emma was in the bridal suite getting ready with her friends. She looked radiant in her wedding dress, a simple but beautiful gown that they had found on sale. Jack was somewhere in the building with his groomsmen, probably nervous and excited. The guests would begin arriving in an hour. Margaret slipped into the music room where the grand piano waited. It was a Steinway like the ones at the academy. She sat at the bench and ran through a few scales to warm up her fingers, then played through the nocturne once quietly, making sure she felt comfortable with this particular instrument. Each piano had its own personality, its own touch and responsiveness. Professor Muller arrived shortly after, dressed in an elegant suit. He had asked to be invited to the wedding, not as a guest exactly, but as Margaret's teacher and supporter. He wanted to be there for this moment, the culmination of 3 months of intensive work. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Terrified and thrilled," Margaret admitted with a laugh. "Is that normal?" "Completely normal. Every performer feels that way before playing something that matters deeply to them. The fear means you care. The thrill means you are alive. Both are good signs." He sat with her for a few minutes, offering quiet encouragement and reminding her of technical points to keep in mind. But mostly he just provided a calming presence, a reminder that she was not alone in this moment. Emma's best friend Jessica found Margaret in the music room about 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. "Mrs. Chen, Emma is asking for you. She wants you with her before she walks down the aisle." Margaret went to the bridal suite where Emma stood before a full-length mirror, making small adjustments to her veil. When she saw her mother, her face lit up with that smile that had been the center of Margaret's world for 28 years. "Mom, you look beautiful," Emma said, hugging her carefully to avoid wrinkling either of their dresses. "Not as beautiful as you, sweetheart. You look like a princess. Your father would be so proud." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. I wish he could be here. He is here, Margaret said softly. He is always with us. And speaking of that, I have something to tell you about the surprise I have been working on. Finally. Are you going to tell me what it is? I am going to play the piano during your ceremony. That Chopin nocturne your father used to hum to you when you were a baby. I have been taking lessons for the past 3 months working to get it perfect for today. Emma stared at her mother in shock. You have been learning to play the piano? Mom, you never told me you could play. It is a long story, one I will tell you properly someday. But yes, I studied music when I was young, before I came to America, before I met your father. I gave it up for many years, but I wanted to bring it back for you for your wedding day. I wanted to give you a piece of your father's memory, played with all the love I have for both of you. Emma burst into tears, not caring anymore about her makeup. She hugged her mother tightly. That is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me. I cannot believe you did this. I did it because you deserve to know that dreams do not have to die. They can sleep for a long time, but if you are willing to wake them up, they are still there. You taught me that. Emma, watching you grow into this strong, beautiful woman, watching you pursue your own dreams and build your own life, it made me realize I could still pursue mine. They held each other for a long moment, mother and daughter, sharing this precious time before Emma began her new chapter. Then Jessica gently reminded them that guests were arriving and the ceremony would begin soon. Margaret made her way back to the music room. The chairs in the adjacent ceremony space were filling up with family and friends. She could hear the soft murmur of conversations, the rustle of programs, the general bustle of people settling in. Her heart began to pound faster. The wedding coordinator peeked into the music room. We are about to start. When you hear me announce the beginning of the ceremony, wait about 30 seconds and then begin playing. Emma will start her walk down the aisle when she hears the music. Is that clear? Margaret nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. The coordinator left, and suddenly Margaret was alone with the piano and her racing thoughts. What if she froze? What if her fingers refused to move? What if she forgot the notes she had practiced so carefully? She closed her eyes and took several deep breaths, using the techniques Professor Muller had taught her for managing performance anxiety. She thought about why she was doing this. Not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, but simply to give her daughter a gift of love, to honor David's memory, to celebrate the beauty that music could bring to important moments. The coordinator's voice came through the speakers in the ceremony space. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to begin. Please take your seats and silence your phones. Welcome to the wedding of Emma Chen and Jack Morrison. Margaret counted to 30 in her head, then placed her fingers on the keys. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. She pressed down on the first notes, and Chopin's immortal melody began to fill the building. The music flowed from her fingers with a grace that surprised even her. All the nervousness seemed to transform into focus. She was not thinking about the individual notes anymore. She was feeling the piece as a whole, as a story unfolding, as an expression of everything beautiful and bittersweet about love and life. In the ceremony space, Emma heard the music begin and gasped. She recognized the melody immediately, that tune her mother had told her about, the one her father used to hum. But hearing it played on a piano, played with such skill and emotion, was overwhelming. Jack looked at her with concern as tears streamed down her face, but she smiled at him through the tears. That is my mom playing, she whispered. That is my mom. She began her walk down the aisle, each step timed to the gentle rhythm of the nocturne. The guests turned to watch the bride, but many of them were also listening to the extraordinary piano performance accompanying her entrance. Who was this pianist? The music was concert quality, filled with nuance and feeling that went far beyond typical wedding entertainment. Margaret could not see Emma walking down the aisle from where she sat at the piano, but she could picture it in her mind. Her baby girl, now a grown woman, taking those final steps as a single person before joining her life with someone else's. The melody seemed to carry all the weight of that moment. The joy and the poignancy, the excitement and the nostalgia. She played the middle section with particular intensity, letting the music swell with emotion. This was the heart of the piece, where Chopin allowed himself to express the full depth of romantic longing. For Margaret, it expressed a mother's fierce love, a widow's enduring connection to her lost husband, a woman's reclamation of her own identity and dreams. As the nocturne moved into its final section, Margaret played with a tender quietness that felt like a blessing. Emma had reached the front of the ceremony space and stood beside Jack, both of them listening to the music with tears in their eyes. The last notes of the piece faded into silence, and for a moment, no one in the room moved or spoke. The beauty of what they had just heard seemed to demand a moment of reverence. Then the room erupted in spontaneous applause. This was unusual for a wedding ceremony, but the guests could not help themselves. They had just witnessed something special, something beyond the ordinary. Many of them were wiping their eyes, moved by the music without even knowing the full story behind it. The officiant, slightly flustered by the unexpected applause, smiled and gestured for everyone to settle down. The ceremony proceeded beautifully, with heartfelt vows and readings from family members. But there was a current of extra emotion running through everything, a sense that something magical had happened at the beginning that set the tone for the whole celebration. After Emma and Jack were pronounced married and had kissed to more applause and cheers, the ceremony transitioned into the reception in the adjacent hall. Margaret remained in the music room for a few moments, sitting at the piano with her hands resting on the closed keyboard cover. She had done it. After 3 months of intensive practice, after 31 years away from serious playing, she had successfully performed at her daughter's wedding. The relief and joy she felt were almost overwhelming. Professor Miller appeared in the doorway. "That was magnificent," he said quietly. "You should be very proud of yourself, not just for the technical excellence, though that was certainly impressive, but for the heart you put into it. Every note sang with meaning." "Thank you," Margaret said, standing up on slightly shaky legs. "Thank you for everything you have done for me. You changed my life." "No," he said with a gentle shake of his head. "You changed your own life. I simply provided the tools and the encouragement. The courage came from you." They walked together into the reception where guests were mingling and finding their seats for dinner. Almost immediately, people began approaching Margaret with questions and compliments. Who was the amazing pianist? Where had Emma found such talent? Several guests assumed she had hired a professional musician and were shocked to learn it had been the bride's mother. Emma found her way through the crowd and threw her arms around Margaret. "Mom, that was the most incredible thing I have ever heard. I had no idea you could play like that. Why did you never tell me?" "Because I had forgotten who I was," Margaret said honestly. "Or maybe I thought that person was gone forever. But she was just sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up." Jack joined them, his own eyes red from crying. "Mrs. Chen, that was beautiful. Emma told me the story about her dad and that melody. Hearing you play it, knowing what it meant to your family, it made me understand something about the love I am joining. Thank you for that gift." As the reception continued, Margaret found herself the center of unexpected attention. Several guests were professional musicians or serious music lovers, and they peppered her with questions about her training and her interpretation of the Chopin piece. One woman, an arts journalist for a local newspaper, asked if she could interview Margaret about her story. A cleaning lady who returns to concert-level piano playing after 30 years to play at her daughter's wedding? That is exactly the kind of human interest story our readers love, the journalist said enthusiastically. "Would you be willing to talk to me about it?" Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness but also excitement. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I would be willing to share my story if it might encourage someone else who feels like they have lost their dreams." Sophia appeared at the reception, having been invited by Professor Mueller as his guest. The young student embraced Margaret warmly. "You were incredible. Even better than at the dress rehearsal. I could feel how much you love your daughter in every note." The two women stood together, an unlikely pair united by their love of music and their determination to pursue it despite obstacles. Sophia was at the beginning of her journey, Margaret in the midst of reclaiming hers, but they recognized something essential in each other. As dinner was served and speeches began, Margaret sat at a table with Professor Muller, Sophia, and a few of Emma's friends who had shown particular interest in the music. Emma's maid of honor gave a touching speech about their friendship, and Jack's best man told funny stories about the groom's notorious inability to cook. But when Emma stood up to say a few words, the room fell completely silent. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," Emma began, her voice strong despite the emotion clearly visible on her face. "Jack and I feel so blessed to be surrounded by people who love and support us. But I need to take a moment to talk about my mom. Margaret felt her face flush as everyone turned to look at her. My whole life, Emma continued, my mom has been my hero. After my dad died when I was 6, she worked 3 jobs to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. She never complained, never asked for help, never gave up. She sacrificed everything so I could have opportunities she never had. I knew she loved me, but I never fully understood the depth of that love until today. Emma's voice broke, and she paused to collect herself. Jack put his hand on her back supportively. What most of you do not know, Emma went on, is that my mom only started taking piano lessons 3 months ago. Well, she studied music when she was young in China, but she gave it up over 30 years ago. She has not touched a piano in decades, but she wanted to play that particular piece at my wedding, because my dad used to hum it to me when I was a baby. So she found a teacher, practiced every spare moment she had, and learned one of Chopin's most beautiful nocturnes just to give me this gift. There were audible gasps around the room. People who had assumed Margaret was a professional pianist were shocked to learn she had only been practicing for 3 months. That is who my mother is, Emma said, tears flowing freely now. She sees something beautiful that she wants to create or share, and she finds a way to make it happen no matter what stands in her way. Mom, you have taught me everything important I know about love, about perseverance, about finding joy, even in difficult circumstances. And today you taught me something new. You taught me that it is never too late to reclaim the parts of yourself that you thought were lost. I love you so much. The room erupted in applause and not a few tears. Margaret was crying too hard to speak, but she blew a kiss to her daughter and mouthed the words, I love you. After dinner there was dancing and celebration. Margaret watched Emma and Jack take their first dance as a married couple, swaying together to a romantic song, completely absorbed in each other. She thought about David, wishing he could see their daughter at this moment so beautiful and happy, embarking on her own adventure. Professor Muller found her standing by herself. You know, he said, I have been teaching for 50 years and I have worked with hundreds of students. Some had more natural talent than you, some had better technical training, but I have rarely seen anyone who understood music as deeply as you do, or who approached it with such genuine humility and hunger. You are going to be an extraordinary teacher. Do you really think so? Margaret asked. I still have so much to learn. Of course you do, we all do. The day we think we know everything about music is the day we should stop teaching. Your willingness to be a student, even while becoming a teacher, will make you effective with your own students. You remember what it feels like to struggle, to doubt yourself, to face what seems impossible. Those are the most valuable lessons you can share. As the evening wore on and the party showed no signs of slowing down, Margaret realized something profound. For 31 years, she had defined herself primarily by her losses and her responsibilities. She was the widow who lost her husband too soon. She was the mother who sacrificed everything. She was the cleaner who scrubbed other people's floors. These identities were not false, but they were incomplete. Now she was also a musician again, a pianist, a woman who could create beauty and move people with her art. And soon she would be a teacher, sharing her knowledge and passion with others. These new identities did not erase the old ones, but they added depth and color to her sense of self. She was not abandoning her past or pretending her struggles had not happened. She was incorporating all of it into a richer, fuller version of herself. The weeks following Emma's wedding were transformative for Margaret in ways she could not have anticipated. The local newspaper published the interview with the arts journalist, and the story of the cleaning lady who became a pianist resonated with readers across the city. The article was shared widely on social media, and suddenly Margaret found herself receiving messages from people all over the world who had been inspired by her journey. One email in particular moved her deeply. It was from a 62-year-old woman in Chicago who had studied violin as a child, but gave it up when she got married. After reading Margaret's story, she had pulled her old violin from the attic and was looking for a teacher. You showed me that it is not too late, she wrote. Thank you for giving me permission to try again. The Riverside Music Academy officially hired Margaret as a part-time instructor beginning in the fall. She would teach adult beginners and returning students, people who had let music slip away from their lives and wanted to reclaim it. Professor Muller helped her design a curriculum that was technically solid, but also emotionally supportive, recognizing that adult students often carried fears and insecurities that children did not. Margaret gradually reduced her cleaning jobs, keeping only one that had flexible hours and decent pay. The financial transition was not easy, but it was manageable. More importantly, her body thanked her. The chronic pain in her back and knees that had been her constant companion for years began to ease. She had more energy, slept better, and felt more alive than she had in decades. Emma and Jack returned from their honeymoon with hundreds of photos and stories to share. They came to Margaret's apartment for dinner, and Emma could not stop talking about how many compliments they had received about the wedding ceremony, and especially the piano music. Everyone said it was the most beautiful wedding they had ever attended. Emma said, her eyes shining. Not because of the decorations or the food, though those were nice too, but because of the emotion. They said they could feel the love in everything, especially in your playing. Some people said they cried even though they did not know us very well, just because the music touched something in them. Jack nodded in agreement. My Uncle George, who is a music professor, said it was one of the finest live performances he had heard in years. He could not believe you had only been practicing for 3 months. He thought we were joking. Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. That piece will always be special to me now. Every time I play it, I will remember your father, and I will remember the look on your face as you walk down the aisle, and I will remember how it feels to reclaim something precious that you thought was lost forever. In August, Margaret began her teacher training program. She attended workshops on pedagogy, studied different teaching methods, and observed experienced instructors working with students. She was the oldest person in the program by more than a decade, but she did not let that intimidate her. If anything, her life experience made her more confident. She had survived much harder challenges than learning to teach piano. Her first official student at the academy was a 47-year-old accountant named Robert, who had always wanted to learn piano but whose parents had insisted he focus on practical subjects when he was young. He was nervous during their first lesson, his hands stiff on the keys, convinced he would be terrible at it. I understand exactly how you feel, Margaret told him. I felt the same way when I returned to piano after 30 years away. But I promise you, if you are patient with yourself and willing to practice regularly, you will surprise yourself with what you can accomplish. Music is not just for the young or the naturally gifted. It is for anyone who wants to bring beauty into their life. She worked with Robert gently but persistently, teaching him the basics of posture, hand position, and reading music. She made sure to praise his small victories and to reframe his mistakes as learning opportunities, rather than failures. By the end of his first month, he could play a simple folk melody with both hands, and the look of joy on his face reminded Margaret of why she was doing this. She took on more students as the fall progressed. A 70-year-old retired librarian, who had always loved music but never had the chance to learn an instrument. A 35-year-old mother of 3 who wanted to model lifelong learning for her children. A 59-year-old businessman who had suffered a heart attack and decided he needed to pursue his passions instead of just working all the time. Each of them came to piano with their own stories, their own fears, their own reasons for trying. Margaret understood them in ways that many teachers could not. She knew what it felt like to be invisible, to have dreams dismissed, to wonder if you were too old or too inexperienced or too ordinary to pursue something beautiful. She never made her students feel foolish for their struggles. Instead, she celebrated their courage for trying, and she shared her own journey as evidence that transformation was possible at any age. Professor Mueller occasionally sat in on her lessons, offering feedback and encouragement. He was impressed by her natural teaching instincts and her ability to connect with students emotionally while still maintaining high technical standards. You have found your calling, he told her after observing a lesson with the retired librarian. This is what you were meant to do, not just play music, but help others discover it within themselves. Sophia, who was now in her 3rd year at the academy, sometimes assisted Margaret with group classes for adults. The young woman had become like a surrogate daughter or perhaps a younger sister. They would have tea together after classes and talk about music, about teaching, about life. Sophia was considering a career in music education rather than performance, inspired partly by watching Margaret's impact on her students. You showed me that being a musician is not just about how well you play, Sophia said during one of their conversations. It is about what the music means, what it does for you and for others. I used to think the only valid career in music was being a concert pianist, but now I see that teaching, especially teaching people who are returning to music or discovering it late in life, is just as valuable and maybe even more fulfilling. Winter arrived, and Margaret found herself busier than she had been in years. But it was a different kind of busy. Instead of exhausting herself with physical labor that left her depleted and aching, she was engaged in work that energized her even when it was tiring. She prepared lesson plans, practiced her own repertoire, graded student assignments, and discovered she loved all of it. Emma announced in December that she was pregnant. The baby was due in early summer. Margaret cried when she heard the news, overwhelmed with joy at the prospect of becoming a grandmother. She thought about David and wished he could be there to meet his grandchild, but she also felt his presence somehow in the happiness of the moment. "I want our child to grow up knowing that dreams matter," Emma told her mother, "that it is never too late to become who you are meant to be. You taught me that this year, Mom. You changed not just your own life, but how I think about my life too. Our baby is going to have the coolest grandmother in the world, one who plays Chopin and inspires people, and never gave up even when things were really hard." As the year came to a close, Margaret reflected on everything that had changed. 12 months ago, she had been scrubbing floors and living a small, quiet life that seemed destined to continue unchanged, until she grew too old to work. She had been invisible to most people, including herself in some ways. Her dreams had seemed so far in the past that they barely felt real anymore. But now she was a pianist again, a teacher, someone who created beauty and helped others discover their own creative potential. She had reconnected with a part of herself that she thought had died, and in doing so, she had become more fully alive than she had been in decades. The Academy held a winter recital in mid-December, and several of Margaret's adult students performed in it. Robert, the accountant who had been so nervous during his first lesson, played a simple Mozart minuet with only a few mistakes, but with genuine musicality. The retired librarian performed a beautiful rendition of Amazing Grace that she had arranged herself. The businessman played a jazz standard that made everyone tap their feet. Margaret watched from the audience with tears of pride in her eyes. She saw in her students the same journey she had taken. The fear at the beginning, the gradual building of confidence, the moment when the music started to flow naturally instead of feeling forced. They were all becoming more than they had been, and she was helping them do it. Professor Muller gave a short speech at the end of the recital, acknowledging all the students and their progress. But he saved his final words for Margaret. "We are blessed to have Mrs. Margaret Chen on our faculty," he said to the assembled crowd of students and families. Many of you have heard her story by now. How she returned to music after 30 years away. How she learned Chopin's Nocturne in 3 months to play at her daughter's wedding. How she inspired countless people with her determination and her artistry. But what you may not know is that she is an equally gifted teacher. Her students do not just learn notes and technique from her. They learn about courage, perseverance, and the importance of pursuing beauty even when life is difficult.